Right, so yeah, hi everyone, good morning. It's great to be able to do this, researchED at home, even though all the sort of researchED live conferences have been cancelled. So what I want to talk to you about this morning is about memory, how you can get students to remember things, how you can teach so that students won't forget. So here's an outline of what I'd like to talk about. First of all, why is it important to remember? Second, why do we forget? What is the forgetting curve? How do we stop it? And then I'm going to give three kind of basic strategies, basic tips for helping students remember, three slightly more advanced ones, and then some further reading and resources, and hopefully finish in time for a few questions and a chance for discussion. So that's the outline. Okay, so why is it important to remember? Now, I'm not going to spend a very, very long time on this question. I'm just going to whiz through a few of the salient points. So why is it important to remember? It's important to remember because long-term memory is a really powerful part of human cognition. And as humans, we have working memory, which is quite limited. You can working memory you can equate with consciousness. So everything you're thinking about right now is going on in working memory. And long-term memory is kind of the vast storehouse of information we have. Long-term memory is much, much bigger than working memory. You can store thousands of items in long-term memory. And so what that means is because working memory is really quite limited and long-term memory is so vast, all of the time when we're reasoning, when we're thinking, when we're solving problems that pop up around us, we're actually drawing on the resources of long-term memory. So even something as straightforward as reading, when you're reading a text, you're drawing on your long-term memory to know what the words mean, to know how the letters form together to make words, to know how the story that you're reading fits in with other stories that you've read. So even when you don't think you're using long-term memory, often you are using long-term memory. So just summarising that, long-term memory, as I say, it's the powerhouse of cognition. It allows us to make sense of the world around us. It allows us to solve problems. It allows us to look things up. It allows us to distinguish between lies and truth. So a lot of the time you'll hear people saying, oh, we need to focus, rather than memory, we need to get pupils to focus on understanding. And one of the big themes of what I want to talk about now is that it's not as simple as that. Memory and understanding, and memory and reasoning, memory and problem solving are far more interlinked than you think. So maybe you're out there thinking, I want my students to be able to solve problems, to have real world skills that they can use in life. Well, memory is a part of that. Memory is not some kind of arid, passive, dry thing that's remote from all of those things. You need it to make sense and to solve problems. And as I say, I'm not dwelling on this too much, but it's something I've written about a lot. And in chapter 3 of my new book, I write about it quite extensively. And in particular, I talk about this particular modern idea that because we've got Google and smartphones, you don't need to look things up any longer. And actually, that's not the case. Just because we can look things up very quickly doesn't mean that it eliminates the need for long-term memory. You can't outsource long-term memory to the cloud. You can't outsource it to Google. And even though you can look things up very quickly online, looking them up imposes a load on working memory, on that really limited working memory that we talked about. And you get the problem where perhaps if you're in the shops and you're trying to quickly see if like a 3 for 2 deal is a good offer or not, having your times tables being really fluent is the kind of thing that's going to help you there. It's going to help you just being able to instantly kind of see and to make sense of that problem. Same with reading. Imagine if you have to stop when you're reading a book and you have to look up every 10th word or every 5th word. How much are you going to understand about the book? So yes, we've got Google, yes, we've got smartphones, but we can't rely on those. We still need information in long-term memory. And one of the themes of my book that I talk about a lot is that we've thought too often, I think, that we can outsource memory to Google, that we don't need facts in long-term memory because we've got smartphones. But actually, what I'm interested in is how can we use technology to improve our long-term memory? So for me, it's not about using technology to outsource long-term memory. It's about using technology to improve long-term memory. And I'm going to talk about that a bit when we get to the end about how technology in particular can help with this, with this issue of memory. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so memory is important. We need information in long-term memory to be able to think. But often it's quite hard to get information into long-term memory. And when I speak about this a lot to groups of teachers, a lot of them will say to me, look, I agree with you, maybe you don't have to convince me of the importance of long-term memory, but how? And a frequent thing that I'll hear from teachers, and that I certainly experienced when I was a teacher, was you teach students something, they really do understand it in the moment. So in that lesson, they're understanding it, they're getting it, it's all making sense, they get to the end of the lesson, you taught them something new and they've got it. and you think, yes, success. And then they come back a week later and they've forgotten it all. And they may not even remember even the topic of what it was you were teaching them. So what is this? What's going on here? Well, what's happening there is not unusual. It's not atypical. And what it is really, it's the forgetting curve. So what I'm going to show you here now is the forgetting curve. And the forgetting curve was really first theorized by a psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus in the 1880s. And he did some really fascinating experiments on himself, where he got himself to remember nonsense syllables, and then he tried to work out how long it took for his memory of those nonsense syllables to decay and to fade away. And he came up with this concept of the forgetting curve. So he would memorize a bunch of nonsense syllables, and as soon as he memorized them up here, immediately after learning, his recollection of them was perfect. So he's memorized them all perfectly. And then he'd come back and he'd say, okay, well, what about 20 minutes after I memorized them? How much do I remember? What's left? And he'd find even after just 20 minutes, he'd lost an awful lot of what he'd remembered. So, you know, about 40% of what he remembers, he's only remembering sort of 60% of what he originally remembered. And then he would say, okay, what about if I don't come back until an hour? And it's still, you know, these are really still sort of big numbers now. He can't remember even more of it. What about if you only come back after 9 hours? Again, then you're only remembering sort of, you know, about 40%. What about if you only come back after a day, to 24 hours? And you can see you're down there almost only a third. So if you memorize something perfectly, after a day, after 24 hours, you're only able to remember a third of it. And after 2 days, after 6, after 31, it then sort of starts to level off. So what Ebbinghaus found is just this really dramatic forgetting, and a lot of the forgetting happening really soon after learning. So his term here for this is the forgetting curve. Now, this was a really seminal study. It's been replicated. It's finally been replicated a number of times in different ways. Most recently, in 2015, some researchers replicated the exact study and came up with really similar findings. So we know there are issues in psychology with replication, but this is definitely not one of them. It definitely is reinforced by a lot of other research. And also, I'd like to think it's something, again, that you probably see in your own life with your students, that things, you do just forget things. Memory will decay. So there's something here that's really, in some ways, quite obvious about this. One critique of the study has been, well, he's memorizing nonsense syllables. Like, what's the point of that? And of course, you're not remembering nonsense syllables because they don't mean anything. Now, that's true to some extent. But the reason why, I should say, Ebbinghaus was trying to do nonsense syllables it's not because he felt that nonsense syllables was something we should all be learning. It was just he wanted to eliminate kind of the variability of when you're memorizing other things. And he actually did do studies where he was memorizing verses from poetry. And he did find something similar, but he did find that some verses of poetry were easier to remember than others. And that was kind of a variable he wanted to control for. So that's why he did the nonsense syllables. But the broad shape of this holds true even for other material. Obviously, for material where you do, as I say, there are some things where it can be sort of naturally easier to remember, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But broadly speaking, that is the forgetting curve. And as I say, that's something I think we can probably observe in our own lives. Even just a really simple example, if I say to you, what did you have for dinner last night? What did you have for dinner a week ago? What did you have for dinner a month ago? I'm going to guess that your memory is not as great for the things that are further away, that you forget these things quite quickly. Okay, so that's the forgetting curve. So the interesting question then, if I can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so the interesting question then is, well, how can we stop the forgetting happening? How do we stop the forgetting? How do we make sure that the things we learn are sealed up in long-term memory and they're not just sort of draining away? And so again, Ebbinghaus and others come up with various things, and two really important things. One, you can make the content more memorable, and the technical term for that is elaborative encoding. And two, you can try active and spaced repetition. So active repetition is when you actively force yourself to recall something from long-term memory, and spaced repetition is just about how you space out those activities, like how frequently you're doing it and at what intervals. And these are two really effective ways of improving memory. And I've got a little analogy here, which I want to share with you, is that the balance between them, I think, is as follows. Let's imagine that you want to come up with a way of really looking after your teeth. Well, one thing you might do is you might come up with you want to learn the best technique for brushing your teeth. So you just find out what is the best way to brush my teeth, that I make sure that I'm going to have really great teeth that are not going to have problems with tooth decay. So that's one thing you might do, come up with the right technique. But imagine if that's all you did, and imagine if you really worked hard to find the best technique for brushing your teeth, but you then only brush your teeth once a year. If you then go to the dentist and say, oh, I don't understand, how come I've got all these problems with tooth decay, because I've got the perfect way of brushing my teeth. Well, obviously you might have come up with a perfect way of brushing your teeth, but that's not enough. You have to also be brushing your teeth very frequently. So it's not just about getting the perfect technique, it's also about frequency and repetition and making things a habit. So you need both. You want to have the best technique for brushing your teeth and do it very frequently. And it's the same with memory. You want to find a way that you can make content really memorable and really sticky and elaborative encoding, but you also need to be practicing it frequently. That's really important as well. And I would certainly say when I trained to teach, I think there was a big focus on making content very memorable. But I didn't think there was as much of a focus on the active and the spaced repetition. And as I say, making the content memorable is important. It's definitely important, but you also, as I say, need that repetition. And I think there's a limit to how far you can go with just trying to make content more memorable. And certainly I felt when I started training to teach, there was a real bit of a sort of a cult of the outstanding lesson, which was the idea that you could teach this, incredibly amazing lesson that will be outstanding. And I think some of the lesson grading practices kind of fed into this. And that was it, that was just perfection. And again, if I can use another analogy, actually on its own, that's the equivalent of trying to make every day like Christmas Day, because Christmas Day is memorable. If we make every day like Christmas Day, every day will be memorable. But again, it just doesn't quite work like that. You need something else as well. And that's where I think the active and the spaced repetition comes in. And I think the active and spaced repetition and the elaborative encoding, actually they work together as well, because one of the things that makes things more memorable is tying them to things that are already in long-term memory. So the more things you have in long-term memory, the easier it is to do the elaborative encoding and build very rich associations and build strong memories. So these two do kind of really work together. And the other thing I'd say, building on from that, is that some of the hardest things actually we have to teach is when we teach students the very first things in a subject, the very beginning, because they often they don't have much in their long-term memory to be able to hook the new information onto. So often it's those early things that are often the toughest, and perhaps the ones where we therefore are relying the most on the active and the spaced repetition. And then as you build up more and more, you can do more and more of that elaborative encoding as well. So just give a simple example of what I mean by elaborative encoding. If you imagine a young child trying to memorize a shopping list, maybe the items on the shopping list don't have as much meaning for them. If you imagine a really experienced cook, often if they have to memorize a shopping list, they're not memorizing it as isolated items. They'll be able to put it into categories of recipes or meals. And so then they're not just memorizing isolated bits of information. They can easily kind of chunk them into concepts that have meaning, but they can only do that because of what's already their store of things in long-term memory that's already there. And you can see that yourself. You just go into the supermarket often. It helps to think about, well, if I want to get, I don't know, bread, milk and cereal breakfast, and then maybe, cheese and fruit at lunch and something like that. That's what makes it easier to remember. Okay, so those are those two things. And let's move on now. Moving on now to remember anything forever, talk about the basics. So I'm going to talk about three kind of basic approaches here, I think, for getting information into long-term memory. And as I say, I talked on the previous about the elaborative encoding and the active and spaced repetition. I am focusing a bit more in this talk on the active and spaced repetition side of things. Although, as I'll come to say later, they are linked. The elaborative encoding and the active and spaced repetition are linked. It's not that they are completely separate, but I am focusing a bit more on the active and spaced repetition. And the problem I'm really trying to address here, the problem I'm really trying to solve, is that problem of you've got students, you've taught them something, you know from your formative assessment and your checking and your end of lesson assessment, you know that the students have understood it in that lesson, but you just have the experience where they come back a couple of days, a week later, and they've forgotten, if not all of it, quite a lot of it. That's the issue I'm trying to address. And that is the issue I certainly encountered as a teacher. I talked to maths teachers in particular. I was an English teacher, but I talked to maths teachers in particular who face this. I was talking to a maths teacher recently who said particularly simultaneous equations, they found that again and again, that they would get to a lesson, the student would be able to do the simultaneous equation, but then they move on, when they come back the next lesson, they've just forgotten so much of what they really did have in the previous lesson. So that's the kind of problem I want to try and solve here. And it's a problem, as I say, that I think every teacher will have encountered with students, but it isn't just a problem you encounter with students, it's a problem that we face as adults. And I think the most common example of how you face this as an adult is maybe you read a book, you really like the book, say a non-fiction book, and it's got a message in it and it's got some really interesting insights, and you read it and you like it and you enjoy it, and you've got a memory of enjoying it and having read it, but perhaps a year later you have very little recollection of actually the details of what was in it. And I certainly find that all the time, that there can be books you enjoy and understand and have that understanding in the moment, but they drain away. And I think that's a problem, because I've certainly encountered the situation where the book I've read a few years ago, there's been something in it that would have been really useful a few years later, and because I've forgotten it, I haven't been able to apply that insight. And then I'll come across the insight again and think, oh, how frustrating, if only I'd remembered it, that would have saved me a lot of time. So this is something that affects students, but it affects adults as well. So that's the kind of main problem I'm dealing with, the problem of you've understood something, but how do you hold it? How do you stop it draining away? So in terms of doing this in the classroom, here are my three first things to start with. So first of all, we're starting here with material students already understood. So that's the point I'm making. We're starting with material that you've taught, they've understood, but you're very worried that they're going to forget it. So the second step is you want to turn this content that the students have understood into flashcards that are as follows: simple, numerous, overlapping. And then the third thing is you want to revise this content, you want your students to revise this content using a spaced repetition flashcard app. So those are the three first basic steps. And I am going to talk you through those in a little bit more detail. So start with material your students have understood. I'm just going to illustrate this using a little bit of information about Shakespeare. So this is just illustrative, this is just a way of a kind of a worked example of what I'm talking about. Let's suppose this is the information you want your students to understand and remember. And this could be something, you might be teaching this across a 6-week unit in year 4, you might be teaching it in one lesson in year 12, but this might be some information that in a wider Shakespeare unit you want your students to retain, and you want them to retain it not just for next week, not just for next month, but if you're a secondary teacher, you're teaching this in year 7, you want your students to retain this when they're doing Shakespeare at GCSE, you want them to retain it when they've left school. This is interesting information, it's useful information, it's valuable information. This is going to help them as they go forward, they'll be able to build on this. And again, if you've taught this in year 7 and they've remembered it, in year 8, you can then build on it and teach some information that builds on it. Whereas if they've forgotten it, you've got to reteach it again, and you're just, you're not able to build. So that's the kind of basic information. And as I say, there'd be a variety of different ways you teach that depending on the phase, the year, how you would bring that alive and make sure students that it has meaning. And then your next thing then would be, right, so you need to turn this content into flashcards that are, first of all, simple. So actually, if I just go back to that previous flashcard, don't have a flashcard with a large chunk of information on it like that. So this is actually, yes, this is the content you want to learn, but this is a bad flashcard. It has too much information on it. And so it's not clear for students testing themselves on that, if they're doing the active recall, how they would know if they've got it right or wrong. There's just too much information on there. So what you want to do is you want to break up all of the content that's there. You want to break it up into something smaller and simpler. So you're breaking it up. There you go. There's one example of a really simple flashcard question. Now, obviously, the response people then have is, oh, yeah, it's so atomized. That's so small. It's just such a trivial bit of information. That's not what Shakespeare's all about. And you're right, it's not. But what I'm saying here is we're taking really big bits of information that are complex and unwieldy, and we're breaking them down into little bits. And obviously, the next step, as I say, it's not just about making them simple, it's about making them numerous. So you haven't just got one flashcard, you've got several. Okay? So rather than having one flashcard with loads of stuff on it, you have several flashcards, and each one is just a little bit. And those are some examples there. And then the next thing you want to do is make them overlapping. And so what do I mean by overlapping? A really obvious example of this is with foreign language vocabulary. That with foreign language vocabulary, you want to have the English word into the foreign language, and then you want to have the foreign language word also into English. that you want to be able to practice making the translation both ways. And so you want to turn the content into flashcards, therefore, that are overlapping. So my example here with Shakespeare would be, you're not just asking when did William Shakespeare live, but you can also say which famous playwright lived from then. So you're getting practice at thinking about the question in both ways. And the thing about that is you're trying to build a sort of flexible knowledge. So it's just not just knowledge that can only work in one way. You're building something that's a bit more flexible. So a couple of other examples of those there as well. And as I say, that's just trying to get that flexibility and get students to be thinking about things that they can also, you're building up the cues that they have for retrieving things from long-term memory. So if they're reading an article and it's talking about the Bard of Avon, that they're used to thinking, Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare, that they've got that cue in there straight away. And what you really are trying to build is a schema. You're trying to build this kind of Shakespeare schema in your students' long-term memory, that when they're hearing the word Shakespeare, it is promoting all of these kinds of associations and thoughts. And similarly, when they're hearing Romeo and Juliet, that's triggering another set of associations of which Shakespeare is a part. And you can see, I just made this, I've just put in a few things that from when I taught Shakespeare I felt were important. Even sort of silly little things like Jacobean. I always found that was sometimes a bit of a stumbling block for students, that they'd be reading something, they understood about, if we're doing Macbeth, they'd understand about James I, understand about Shakespeare, but Jacobean, hang on, what does that mean? And so even just knowing that, it's stopping a kind of block that might happen when they're reading something, something that might, as I say, really sort of, they will stumble on and will stop them understanding the wider meaning. So that's what you're trying to build up. And the hope would be that over time, at primary or secondary, sixth form, all of them together, you're building the richness of that schema and you're adding to it all the time, and the schema is getting richer and richer and more powerful. Okay, so that's the bit about creating the flashcards. The next thing is, as I say, is, well, how are you going to get students to remember these and to not have this forgetting curve problem? So the next thing we need to do is we need to revise in such a way that we're going to interrupt this forgetting curve. So let's just remind ourselves of the forgetting curve. We saw that on a previous slide. That's a forgetting curve. And as I said before, that data is from Ebbinghouse's original experiment. Now, what you want to try and do now is to interrupt this forgetting curve. So this blue line here is from Ebbinghouse's original data. What I'm going to show you now is actually data I've laid on top of this. This is not from Ebbinghouse's original data, but this is kind of taken from other research showing how you can interrupt this forgetting curve and how you can build memory. So what you want to do is, after 20 minutes, you've learned all your Shakespeare stuff. After 20 minutes, you want to interrupt that forgetting curve by revising what you've just learned. So after 20 minutes, you revise it and you top it up. So it's after 20 minutes, it's decayed down to kind of 60%, but you revise it and so it's perfect again. You top up to 100%. And then what's great is that it will start to decay again. So the memory will start to decay again, but it will decay at a slightly kind of slower rate. And that might be a little bit tricky to spot on this graph. It's a log scale, but essentially it's just not decaying as fast as it would have done if it had just been sort of one repetition. And then what you do is you then follow up again. Let's do another repetition. Let's do our review the next time. It was an hour. So let's come back and review, top up to 100%. And again, the decay, you've just slightly slowed down the decay again. And then let's come back after 9 hours, let's come back after 24. And every time you're reviewing it, it's not just that you're topping it up to 100%, it's that you're slowing down the subsequent decay. So you keep topping up and you can see the curves are just gradually kind of flattening. We're all very familiar with flattening the curve now. This is flattening the curve in kind of a different way. We're trying to flatten that curve so that the memory is staying up there in the kind of 80, 90, 100% region, rather than decaying down to the 20, 30% region if there's nothing that you would do. Now, there's a lot of different literature and often some really quite complicated mathematical equations about exactly how much each review will slow the curve down by. But a kind of nice rule of thumb that I've taken from a few of the more practical applications of this is that if you do 7 consecutive correct reviews, and you do them spaced out in this way, so they're spaced out, so they're gradually increasing spacings, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. That if you do about 7 or 8 of those, you can get your recollection, your memory of it up to about 90%. So rather than having it decaying down to 30%, you can push that up to about 90% if you get about 7 or 8 recollections all spaced out, and that will then sustain over quite a long period of time too. So let's just have a little look about how this might work with some Shakespeare. So here, what you'll see, these blue bars are kind of the intervals, and you'll see that the intervals are gradually increasing in time. So this is what I mean about spaced repetition. You're spacing things out, and every time you get a question right, you then don't have to come back to it as frequently. And you can see the intervals are increasing here, approximately kind of by 2.5 times. So let's have a look. Let's say you've got a fact about Shakespeare, comes up on your flashcard, you get it right. You come back after 10 minutes, you get it right. You come back after a day, you get it right. You come back after 3 days, you get it right. You then have to come back after 7 days. And then it's 17. And then the real genius of the spaced repetition is because these intervals keep increasing by 2.5 times, you very rapidly get to a point where you don't have to be reviewing it that often. And very rapidly that will get up to being months and years. So, but because you've been getting it right and you've been having that practice of recalling it, that's been strengthening the memory, you can still very rapidly get up to kind of 90% recall, even though after 7 or 8 repetitions, you're not going to be looking at it for months or even years. What about though, I've said here you're getting it right, what about if you're getting it wrong? Well, this is where kind of a personalized aspect comes into it. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, well, some material maybe is just harder to memorize than others. And some people find certain material harder to memorize than others. That's absolutely right. So let's imagine you're memorizing a fact about Elizabeth I and you just find it a bit trickier and you get it right the first couple of times, but then you get to this point, you get it wrong. Well, then what happens with spaced repetition is it goes right back to the beginning. So you take it right back to the beginning and you set it at the start of the cycle again. So that's kind of how the spaced repetition is working. You're getting more practice on the cards that you struggle with, and the ones that you're really are flying away with, they will just, and not have to come up that frequently. So you kind of won't have to almost, waste your time reviewing things that you have got locked down and you do know very, very well. So what's really clever about this is it's quite simple and efficient way of really building up that long-term memory, and it's taking advantage of some of these insights from Ebbinghaus that go back, as I say, over 100 years. Now, I've said here revise using a spaced repetition app. I haven't mentioned which spaced repetition app. Now, there are a number of different ones out there. There's some free, there's some that have subscriptions. I would say the one that I have used, and in the further reading here, I've got examples of people who use it. The one I use personally is one called Anki, and the 2.5, the multiply by 2.5 interval is one that I take from Anki. But Anki is not the only one out there. There is Quizlet, which I know is quite popular. Quizlet do have an interesting blog on their website about how they do spaced repetition, and that might be something to look at. But before you look at that, I think Quizlet is more student friendly. And there are other examples too. So this is not about me recommending a particular approach. There's also, in the further reading, I'll put a link to how you can create one, not using technology, just using a shoebox and flashcards. I must say, while some people like that approach, I personally find it quite complex to stay on top of all of those. And to go back to my original point about technology, I really think this is an area where technology comes into its own, because I genuinely think this is the kind of thing, if you're managing a shoebox and potentially hundreds, and if you're doing it for years, potentially thousands of index cards, it can rapidly get quite unwieldy, and it can be pretty hard to kind of remember exactly how frequently you've got to be putting everything into the right sections of the shoebox. So for me, this is an area where technology really does come into its own. And to go back to what I said before, this is a way where you are using technology to not to outsource memory, but to enhance it. And for me, that's where really the power of this lies. So yeah, I would say, you can have a look at the various different sort of apps out there and find one that maybe suits you and suits your purposes the most. Okay, so those are my 3 basic tips. I now want to do just a few more advanced things to think about, which are as follows. So these are the 3 more advanced things I want to talk about. I've talked a lot here about understanding first, memorizing later. But actually, I want to complicate that slightly. I don't think it is as straightforward as that. I also think a good way to work is to design the flashcards and the lesson together. So to try and integrate that process when you're planning. And thirdly, I think a really powerful thing to do, which is not that common, is to put all your flashcards, or all of a student's flashcards into one deck and revise the deck daily. So I think we're quite used to maybe having flashcards for one subject or one topic. And what I'm saying is put everything in together. So let me just talk through each one of those in turn. So the first one, understand first, memorize later. I have kind of fallen into this dichotomy a bit here. And in some ways, I think it is helpful to think about understanding first and memorizing later. So the reason I think it is helpful to think in that way is what I think is really bad practice with flashcards is when people say, okay, well, just memorize all the capitals of the world, or memorize every American president or whatever. And you can find flashcard decks out there that are pre-made, that have that information in them, and you can go off and kind of do those. And I don't think that is great practice. And sometimes it can work if you have some sort of understanding already, and sometimes it just actually, you know, it won't work because you don't have any meaning, you don't have anything to hang that information on. And so actually this approach then is not going to work, and it become quite demoralizing. That's why I say it's important that you've got some understanding first, or you're not neglecting that understanding, that you're thinking about, well, not just learning the names of these capitals and the countries, but learning something about the capital, about the country, something that you're building up, as I say, that schema in long-term memory. So that's one reason why I think I did talk about the understanding and memorization as being slightly different. But in other ways, I think it is a bit of a false dichotomy. And I think this because when you understand something, when you memorize it, it often gives you the chance to have a deeper understanding, and an understanding that often would not have been possible without the memorization. And when you have it so secure and so locked down that it's just automatic, it also promotes pattern recognition. It promotes you recognizing things in new contexts. So I just want to give a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. And I'm going to give some examples actually from, not from students, but from adults who have used this kind of memory approach, because I want to show you that even for, again, this is not a really basic passive tool I'm talking about. It's something that can be quite sophisticated. So one of the articles on having your own personal flashcard deck, which has really influenced me, is one by a physicist called Michael Nielsen. And he writes a lot about how he uses Anki. And one of the things he says is that what he's learned from memorizing dates of certain events, one example he gives is that in 1962 was the year the first telecommunications satellite was put into orbit. But then he also says that that was in 1962, and it was launched 5 years after the first Soviet satellite, Sputnik. And he says, these are his own words, he said, I personally find it fascinating that kind of the communications satellite, Telstar, it was put into orbit the year before the introduction of ASCII, which is the first modern digital standard for communicating text. And he says, so what that means is humanity had a telecommunications satellite before it had a digital standard for communicating text. And in his words, he says, finding that kind of connection is really powerful. And that's something that is an example of elaborative encoding, but it's also something that's coming from your memory of all these different dates. And so when people sometimes say, oh, memorizing dates, isn't that a bit trivial? You don't really need to know these precise dates. Well, the advantage of knowing the precise dates is you can start to work out surprising things like that of when things happen in unexpected sequences, when things happen, they might have caused other things. You can't know those until you have the dates. And then another example, this is from about memorizing poetry, and this is from a kind of famous poetry anthology, Other Men's Flowers, by the British general in World War II, Archibald Wavell. And he says he was really keen on memorizing poetry, and he said that the reason why is that his experience was you can't properly appreciate a poem until you've got it by heart. And in his words, he says, memory stumbles over a word or a line and wonders why the poet wrote it so, and then savours it slowly so that its meaning and relish may stay. I think that's very true of poetry as well. I would certainly say from the poetry I've memorised, there's all kinds of insights that you get with where if you hadn't memorised it, perhaps you wouldn't have quite understood and focused on particular words or phrases in that same way. So there is a real value, real understanding that can come from memorisation. And if we just go back on the next slide, I've got my Shakespeare schema again. So this is moving on to my second point about designing flashcards and lessons together. if you design the flashcard and lesson together, you can try and promote this, if you like, nice memorization understanding cycle. And you can do that by perhaps when you set the first flashcards for the students to memorize, you can maybe ask them to come up with 3 questions that they have as a result of doing those flashcards. So are there any questions that this memorization has sparked for you? And here's some examples of what you might hope to get. This is really interesting. Shakespeare, he's written approximately 39 plays. Well, that's something, well, when you're focusing on that and you're remembering it, approximately 39 and not exactly 39, like, why don't we know? How do we know that it's not precisely 39? And that leads to some really interesting, deeper questions that will deepen your understanding of Shakespeare. So why is it approximately? Well, we don't really have great records of Shakespeare's time. So there's a lot of things we're not clear about. And another reason is because we know he collaborated on plays. So he didn't just write everything on his own. There's some things where we know he collaborated with people. We're not quite sure what the balance was or how much he contributed. So that's why it's approximate. And again, that's giving you more insight into Shakespeare's time. Another thing you might think about, and this is one of the advantages, I think, of remembering places, kind of analogous to remembering dates, which is, okay, he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, but actually he seemed to have put on most of his most famous plays at the Globe Theatre in London. So what happened there? And students might ask, well, how close are those 2 places? Why did he leave Stratford-upon-Avon? You know, did he go back? And so that kind of geographical knowledge can promote some very interesting questions too, and you can have those kinds of discussions. So that's what I'm saying about the understanding of the memorization can go in lockstep. And the more that you memorize, the more it can encourage those kinds of questions and lead to those kinds of questions, where if you were just kind of having more of a passive understanding of it and just a read through, you wouldn't get that depth of understanding that you would really be able to get that. So that's some of the advantages of memorization. And then finally, put all the flashcards into one deck and revise the deck daily. So the whole point about spaced repetition is you don't have to memorize, you don't have to review every flashcard every day. That's the whole point of it. The whole point of it is you have these expanding intervals. But there is a real value to getting into the habit of revising a deck every day. So you won't be revising all of the flashcards every day. You'll be revising a percentage of them every day. And as I say, it's a good idea to get into the habit of revising it daily. And you can do that by putting all the flashcards from every subject into one deck. So as I say, the advantage of doing this is if you've only got one deck of just Shakespeare's life and it's only got a few cards in it, with spaced repetition, you'll quickly get to the point where most days you don't have to review any from it. And then you're out of the habit. But if you build up one really big deck, there'll always be new ones to revise. So you can always log onto it and know that you've got a few flashcards that you need to review. So it can make it a habit. Whereas if you're just dealing with one small flashcard deck, it can be easy for it to fall out of being a habit, because most days you won't have to review very many. And the other thing, the really almost the more important thing about putting all the flashcards into one deck is that it can make the knowledge more flexible and encourage creativity. So the reason for this is that if you've got flashcards from lots of different subjects all in the same deck, you don't know what order they're going to come up in, and you find yourself answering flashcards from different subjects consecutively. And the nice thing about that is, I've noticed from doing this, is you can feel almost the gears of your mind kind of grinding as they're moving from one topic to another. And I think this is a kind of a desirable difficulty. And I think this is another one you want to be careful with, because you don't want to go in with this too soon. You want to make sure, I would start with learning the thing kind of individually and then filter them into a bigger flashcard deck. And so the advantage of it is that you might have a maths question followed by a question about Shakespeare's life and times. And so, as I say, you're having to be flexible and move back and forward. And in some cases, so not only does that kind of promote more kind of real world uses of knowledge, it promotes you being able to use it in different contexts, not just in the very sort of narrow context bound of your particular classroom. But you also sometimes get interesting links, interesting unexpected sort of you know moments of serendipity, where you have two things that are quite unrelated, but you get them next to each other, and actually that can spark some connections and insights. And it comes back to what I said before about pattern recognition, that a lot of creativity often is about pattern recognition. and it's about something that you've learned in one context, being able to see how that can apply in another. And as I say, I think putting all your flashcards from different subjects into one deck can really promote that. But as I say, I would also be careful with it, in that you still want to make sure that you've understood it at first, and it's that kind of tension of when does a desirable difficulty become undesirable. So moving on now to further reading. This is going to just, if you really want to put these kinds of things into practice, I've got some resources here. So if you want, you can download a set of flashcards about this presentation. And actually, in order to get them, if you go to my website, sign up to my mailing list, you will then get an email with them. So you can download a set of flashcards about this presentation. And what I've done is I've done a set of flashcards about this presentation. So I've done a set of flashcards about spaced repetition using flashcards. I've also done a set about Shakespeare's life, and I've done another set with the 7, 8 and 9 times tables. And at the moment, you can download them, they're separate. So there's 3 separate decks, one about spaced repetition, one about Shakespeare, one about the 7, 8 and 9 times tables. But then once you've reviewed them, once you've got your students to review them, you could combine them all together. And that would just be a way of illustrating what I've talked about, which is about trying to get your mind to move from different topics. So I'm assuming that students would already know the 7, 8, 9 times tables. They'd already know a bit about Shakespeare's life, and ideally they'd watch this video, or you would present the concepts in it to them. So they would have that understanding, and they would use the flashcards to revise. And then if you combine all those flashcards together into one deck, you can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about your mind moving from different topics and it promoting that flexibility of thought. But as I say, that is something, it needs to be a desirable difficulty. You don't want to make it too difficult. If it's students who have never learnt their 7, 8 and 9 timetable, they've never learned anything about Shakespeare's life, that wouldn't be a great way to start with it. You want to make sure they've got that bit of understanding first, then you go in with the memorization. And then, as I say, actually, maybe you get into that nice kind of flywheel where the memorization and the understanding work in tandem. So if you would like to get those resources, I will make sure these slides are shared afterwards, and they've got the links in for you to be able to get them. So if you would like to give this a go, yeah, keep an eye on my blog, which is daisychristodoulou.com, and the resources will be up there shortly. And the other thing you can do is actually read Teachers versus Tech, my book. I'm going to put in another plug for that there. I told you in chapter 3, I talk a lot about why you can't just Google it. In chapter 4, I talk a lot about this whole principle of spaced repetition, of flashcards, of how you can use quizzing and spaced repetition to help really build those memories and make sure they don't decay. Okay, so that is my whistle-stop tour through spaced repetition, how to remember anything forever, how to get your students to remember anything forever. So I'm going to pause there, go back to Helene and take some questions from some of you.
Thank you, Daisy. Can I just ask you first, can you put can you show the previous slide again, the one that says all flashcards in one deck?
Yes, that one.
Yeah. Just to start with a comment, perhaps, someone, Russell, who's a history teacher, who seems to agree with you. I think the date example is great for why sometimes memorization first can lead to self-generated links and understanding. So someone who recognized that in their own teaching. Yeah. In history, I like how learning dates can help you to notice things that were happening simultaneously across different parts of the world or in different societies. So there you go. Right, so lots of questions came in which are kind of related. And you touched upon that when you said, you were talking about, who should design the cards, and perhaps sometimes in the lesson, the teacher and the students can create the cards together, and you can encourage students to ask questions. But there's lots and lots of questions about that. What are the tensions there? Is it better to get the students to create them? Is it better for the teacher to create the flashcards? And also, another one related to that is, can you use that with students as young as year 2 or year 3 children?
Yeah. So that is a great question about who should create the flashcards. And actually, I'm glad it's been asked, because I did have some material that I was going to include and I cut it because of time. So if I'd It would have been like the next thing I would have talked about. And I think it is complex. And you will see on a lot of flashcard sites, they'll say, look, you know, the gold standard is you creating your own flashcard decks. You don't want to be downloading those created by others. And I know why people say that, but I am slightly uneasy, particularly with younger children. And the reason for this is I think creating a good flashcard is not easy. And the principles I've talked about there of simple, numerous, overlapping, it's not always easy, and easy to get it wrong. And I would say that in my own experience, as I say, I use this approach myself, and I have a pretty big flashcard Anki deck myself, that I've noticed that the cards I created a year, 18 months ago are not as good as the cards I create now. So, you know, and in some ways, when I go look at them, the ones I did 18 months ago, I think, oh, no, actually, I shouldn't have done it like that. I should have done it like this. And that would be a better question. And I should also ask the reverse question. So the point is, I'm noticing over time as I gain experience and get better, that a lot of the decks I created weren't ideal. I think it's, again, a bit of a challenge to expect students to do that really well to begin with. So I think this is one of these things, it's a bit of the novice expert problem, that generating flashcards does have all kinds of benefits of you thinking through the material and giving you that deeper insight if you're good at creating flashcards and you know the content. If you're a novice at creating flashcards and you're a novice with the content, it's really likely you'll come up with poor flashcards. So I think it's a challenge, and I would certainly, with younger students, I would want to start off by creating them themselves for them, and perhaps as they got a bit older and a bit better, or got a bit more understanding of this topic, they could start to add in some of their own, and you could review those and tell them if they were working. But I don't think there's anything bad necessarily when you're beginning with starting with flashcards other people have created. The other thing I would add in is that even when you are good at creating flashcards and you know the content, you only want to create the flashcard yourself if doing so is a desirable difficulty that is promoting, if you like, kind of germane cognitive load. Let me give an example of where that's not the case. I wanted to recently memorise the London boroughs. There's 33 London boroughs, and I wanted to memorise them on a map. And I couldn't find any deck that had been created, so I created my own using images I got from Wikipedia. And most of the time I spent creating them did not really have much to do with thinking about the London boroughs. It was all about kind of images and the image resolution, and was I getting it right, and was I pacing it in the right way? And it was, you know, it was fairly tedious and wasn't really aimed at helping me understand anything better. So if someone had had a deck that's already completed like that, I would have been better off just downloading it. So I think probably creating your own is like something to aspire to, and I know why people say it's the gold standard, and I know why, and definitely the process of creating them does deepen your understanding, but there is a novice expert issue going on. It is very easy to create bad flashcards. When you create bad flashcards, you're putting people off flashcards altogether. So you've got to be careful. You know, it's a balance.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of other questions related to that as well, but you've kind of tackled quite a lot of the other ones, which were focusing on novice, expert, or someone coming to a subject that they've never studied before. So I'll move on. A few questions on the app that you've mentioned, Anki, because apparently there are different versions. So which version do you use? Someone says that it's actually quite great, but how do you get around the Excel upload issues?
Yeah, so I'm actually just trying to have a look so I can get the Q&A. Sorry, so I'm just, it'd be nice for me to see some of these too. So as I say, I use Anki. I think Anki has lots of good things, I say. I know that some people don't like it, and in lots of ways people say it's maybe a little bit, you know, a bit ugly, and for students it's not very user-friendly. I will share the link of the one I use. I know there are a couple. I know there's a couple that are called Anki but are actually slightly different. I only realised that recently myself when someone was just asking exactly that. Yeah, there's different ones. That's right. And the other thing I'd say as well is that the algorithm that underpins Anki, and when I'll make sure the slides are available, and the slides will have a lot of links in, but the algorithm that underpins Anki is one that I think is originally developed from the super memo algorithms, which was developed by this guy, Piotr Wozniak, who did a lot of work on developing these sort of space repetition systems. So there are a lot of systems which have different names but are kind of using the same underlying algorithm. So there's that to think about as well. I personally, yeah, I think the one I've gone for is the Anki web. It's the blue one, not the orange one, if that makes sense. I will put the link, the slides I give people to download, the decks I give people to download will be the from the one I use. Again, like, I'm not here to kind of endorse or have a go at any particular ones. I think there's lots of different systems out there, and to some extent it's finding one that works for you or works for your students, and some might be better for adults and better for students. So yeah, but I'll share from the ones I use, and I do think the thing with Anki is it's very, very powerful. It may not be the most intuitive or child friendly, but it is very powerful, and there's a lot you can do behind the scenes and a lot of data you can get out of it.
Thank you. Do you think the content needs to be reduced to give time to spaced and interleaved practice?
Yeah, really good question. Reducing content. So this is one of these where I think it's almost, if you go back to the, in fact, if I put it up again, the great thing about spaced repetition is exponential. So you start off, I'm just going to resume share. So if we go back to this, if you look at those blue lines, those are the gaps in between. Can you see that? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are the gaps in between repetitions. So obviously you start out and yeah, you are just reviewing the same material quite frequently, but very rapidly the gaps increase. So for me, it's about when you start learning something, you do want to spend a lot of time kind of establishing the basics, and you do want to spend a lot of time making sure you've got it locked down. But then if you've done all that right, it's kind of locked in. So the great thing about this is I think it is a time saver. And it's one of these, it might not feel like a time saver at first because you have to go back and do the revision, but you're doing the revision in the most efficient and effective way. So you're saving yourself time in the long run. And there's a big sort of debate in the literature about why it is that spaced repetition has never properly kind of caught on. And one of the quotations from one of the pieces of literature is, this is probably, it's a case study in the failure to implement psychological research. And I think one of the reasons is because it's in lots of ways it feels a bit unnatural, and the process of cramming, which is, you know, really just spending a lot of time on something to begin with and then not coming back to it, almost feels more natural. And in lots of ways we've set up our school system to promote cramming in lots of ways. So I think the interesting about this is if you actually organise a school system and a curriculum around the process of spaced repetition, you wouldn't have to reduce the content you taught. You could teach as much, maybe possibly, you know, I would say actually more, because you're not having to deal with the fact that you're constantly having to just start from scratch and repeat things because students have forgotten it all. So yeah, I think you can get through more by doing this.
Mm. I mean, we've had these discussions with lots of teachers.
And I'll just add in one thing there as well, actually, that in terms of adult use of Anki, one of the most popular sort of groups of people who love using Anki is medical students, because they have to remember so much. So medical students, they're not using this to reduce the amount they've got to learn. They've got to learn phenomenal amounts, and they've effectively concluded that this is the most efficient way of doing it. And it was the same with this guy, Piotr Wozniak, who developed the super memory algorithm. He was studying biology, he wanted to learn English, and he was just kind of almost appalled at the sheer amount he would have to learn, you know, the amount of vocabulary, the amount of things you learn in biology. And he developed this just as a way of trying to deal with massive amounts of content. So I think if you think that the pioneers of people who are using this are people who are using it to learn far, far more than we're accustomed to dealing with, really, probably in schools.
Yeah, so you've just addressed the other thing, that, you know, the argument from teachers that there's just no time, there's just too much to cover. So
this is it. So I know that there are plenty of subjects in secondary you think there are no time, and they're saying that is exactly the thing that was motivating a lot of these medical students. Where do I get the time to memorise all this stuff? And I think this is the most effective way I've seen of finding that time, of making it more efficient.
So linked to that, for all the students, say A-level students, where the information is complex, what is the flashcard creation guidance? A huge deck or more info per card? Have you seen a good example?
Yeah, so I would definitely say a huge deck. I'd definitely say not more info per card. And that was the message I was saying in the first 3 basic steps. And again, Wozniak, he has 20 steps for formulating knowledge, you know, 20 steps. And I took a lot of what I take there is taken from a couple of his steps. So you definitely, I would say, want more flashcards rather than more complex flashcards, if you see what I mean. So it's about the challenges, breaking the complex content down into the small steps. And as I say, it is great when students get to the point they can do that themselves, but that in itself is tough. And so the challenge, if you give it to them to do, is they might not get it right. So that's why I think you have to, with some of that more complex content, be thinking about how you would break it down. And I think this can definitely, I mean, I've talked here obviously about almost, you know, Shakespeare, history, but you can definitely work for things like maths. If you need to remember formulas, or you need to remember examples of how formulas work, this can be really powerful. You know, you can, I personally think if you put in the formula, but not just the formula, put in some examples of the formula in action, that can just get you more familiar with exactly how it works. So yeah, I think there are applications for every subject you can think of, and for pretty much every age group as well.
You've just tackled another question there at the same time. Okay, someone was just saying, my UCL med student son is struggling with flashcards, just as an aside. Yeah. How do you plan this when making a scheme of work? Do you have an audit of all the things you want them to learn or something?
Yeah, so I think the best way of doing it is to plan it for a scheme of work. So do it within the context of planning the scheme of work, and be thinking, the way I like to think about it as well is to make sure you're really remembering the important things. What are the things I want them to remember in a year's time? And that's why the Shakespeare example is a nice one, because a lot of schools, they'll do a Shakespeare play or 2 plays, you know, maybe at Key Stage 3, and they'll do one at GCSE. So I'm saying, if you're teaching students Midsummer Night's Dream in year 7, and you know they're going to come back and do Shakespeare, do Romeo and Juliet in year 10, for argument's sake, what do you want them to know about Midsummer Night's Dream that you want them to remember when they're in year 10? And I think for any subject, that's a great thing to think about. So actually not just thinking about it within a scheme of work, but thinking about it across 5 years. Actually, that's the most powerful thing to do. And to sit down as a department and say, well, what should we be doing in year 7? Or at primary, what should we be doing in year 3 that we want students to have in year 4, year 5, year 6? And to be thinking of it as, well, we can start with these basic things about Shakespeare, we can make sure they remember those, and we can build. And then also making the links across topics. So maybe we're going to do Shakespeare in year 7, and we're going to do, maybe we're going to do a Sherlock Holmes short story, but then I know they're going to do a Christmas Carol at GCSE. And so how am I going to make sure, what are the things I want them to remember about Victorian London? And then maybe the history department will say, hang on a minute, we do this here, and we want those links to come in. And that comes back to what I said, you know, one of the comments before said that when you know dates of things that are happening, you realise stuff is happening at the same time. And you think, oh, isn't that interesting? And that's, again, building and deepening that schema, and that can only come through the memory. So I would sit down, again, not just looking at it with a scheme of work, but look at it across the year and focus on what the things are important. I'm not saying here that you want them to remember absolutely every detail of what you are teaching. As I say, you do want to probably be focusing on what are the things I want them to remember in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time. So there will be some details that you need for that unit of work, but you probably don't need for the long term. But there will be some details where you think, yeah, this is really important for them to remember going forward.
Thank you. I think you've just partially answered the next one. How do we take it to the next level so it's not just fact retrieval in the classroom?
Yeah, I think the next level is almost just the more of them that you have. And when you build really big flashcard decks, it does become really powerful, and you really do get those links. And as I say, there's a lot of adults who use this approach, and one of the ones that I'll put in the reading list is by Michael Nielsen, Augmenting Cognition. He is a physicist, and he recently he's written this very long article about how he uses Anki, and he talked about how he used it to help him write an article about Google's new AlphaGo artificial intelligence. And he said he basically started with the research paper and worked his way through the research paper, first of all adding very simple questions, then adding increasingly more complex ones. And this is about, you know, a topic that's kind of at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence and very complex. And he is saying that flashcards helped him to understand it, that by adding more and more of them, he was just building up that more solid understanding of what it was. So I would definitely say it is something you can use for kind of the most complex types of understanding. I would really say that. And in some ways, give it a go, you know, give it a go and see as you build up over time where you can go with it.
I'm going to ask you this one, even though I think it's noon already, but it's been asked twice. Do you think that the work on memory links really nicely with direct instruction?
Yeah, I do. I think what flashcards and direct instruction have in common is the breaking down of a complex skill into small pieces. And that's, I think, the thing that also makes them a little bit controversial, and why you get people saying, oh, but it's very reductive. And in some ways it is reductive, and the strength of it is reductive because you're taking something that's really complicated and you're saying, well, look, because we've got limited working memories, there's a limited amount we can study. The only way often we can approach these very complex subjects is to break them down, get one chunk, hold that chunk, add the new chunk, put the chunks together. And when you do that, yeah, you know what, it can look reductive. But that's why I always say to people, you can't look at it. To go back to my toothbrush analogy, you can't look at somebody brushing their teeth one morning and going, well, you only brushed your teeth, for one morning. That's so reductive. It's like you can't just isolate that. You've got to view it as part of. It's not just that one isolated moment of toothbrushing. I'm doing that twice a day for a year, or twice a day for my life, and that is what contributes to it. So if you pull out these individual questions, they do often look reductive. But as I say, you've got to view them that they're not just these individual pieces; they are part of a whole. So yes, I think the thing that direct instruction and flashcards have in common is the breaking down of the complex into the individual chunks.
Yeah, itemization. Could this be a library resource and flash decks be set as homework tasks across the whole year?
Yeah, so I would say if I were designing, what would be my perfect system for this in a school from scratch, it would be that this would be your homework. This would be all homework. So homework wouldn't be doing new stuff. And in fact, then you wouldn't necessarily be doing the flashcards in school. Like you would learn, the teacher would say, okay, those questions, those flashcards are now in your flashcard deck. And, so then just your homework is always spend 10 to 20 minutes review every day reviewing your flashcards. That could pretty much be most of your homework. I mean, for older students, you might then also, you're going to need other things too, but certainly for younger students, that would be an amazing homework, and relatively simple and straightforward to implement, to check, to administer, and that you would also, it would become very easy to become a habit. So it's not something where you're like, oh, I didn't understand it, or I didn't know what I had to do. Like once you set it up, it's like, okay, that's your homework every day, 10, 20 minutes of flashcard revision. So that would be amazing. But I can see that obviously, the systems that would need to change for that to happen. But I think that would be a really nice way of doing things.
Okay, Daisy, we're going to have to stop, I think. We still have lots and lots of questions, so I will send them to you. Sure. I don't know if there's anything that you feel that you need to address, but a lot of them you've kind of addressed anyway. Thank you very much for your time. You said you would share some resources, so
I'll put them on my website. So my blog is daisychristodoulou.com. So hopefully by the end of today, I will get up those slides and a link to how you can get the flashcards. So take a look back there at the end of today, and I'll get those up there for you.
Okay, and we'll link the blog once the video is uploaded to YouTube. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Cheers. Thanks for popping in. Tomorrow we'll be welcoming Eva Hartel. So another good session there for you at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Great, thanks.